listening to the Art of Homeschooling podcast, where we help parents cultivate creativity and connection at home. I'm your host, Jean Miller, and here on this podcast, you'll find stories and inspiration to bring you the confidence you need to make homeschooling work for your family. Let's begin. Well, hey there, my friend, and welcome to episode 60 here at the Art of Homeschooling podcast. Why choose the Waldorf approach to homeschooling? In this episode, I want to share what appeals to me most about Waldorf and why I chose the Waldorf approach for my family. But I think that this will help you no matter what your homeschool looks like, to help you clarify the focus and direction of your homeschooling journey and decide if you want to bring more Waldorf-inspired or hands-on activities to the lessons. Because I think when we understand and feel committed to the reasons behind our choices, that becomes then our motivation to stay the course and keep going. It really helps make homeschooling more sustainable. So first, let me say, if you want to hear about my journey to homeschooling, you might want to go have a listen to the very first episode ever recorded on the podcast, episode 1, Homeschooling is a Journey. In that episode, I share stories of my family's journey from the very beginning of choosing to homeschool, why we chose to homeschool, when we chose, all the way through graduating 3 kids from our homeschool. In this episode, I want to dive a little deeper into my own homeschooling journey and specifically talk about why I chose the Waldorf approach as my main source of inspiration, so that you can then decide for yourself what inspires you and keeps you going as a homeschooling parent. So Waldorf education has always resonated deeply with me from the very first time I ever heard of it. I will, however, be the first to admit that there have been years when I was totally overwhelmed by life, right? Whether that was by illness or a new baby, whatever. When I relied during those years on rote curriculum packages or workbooks, worksheets for periods of time. But that never lasted very long and wasn't very satisfying to me or my children. I've always found my way back to the Waldorf approach, which speaks so deeply to me, probably to all of us on a deeper level. I often say that it feeds our souls. And one thing I wish I'd known earlier on is that bringing any piece of the Waldorf approach to your children and your homeschool is worth it. It's not all or nothing. So before we go any further, though, let me ask you a question. In your opinion, what is Waldorf? Now, I know there's going to be a range. Like some of you may know a lot about the Waldorf approach. Some of you may know very little about it. But if you know anything at all, it can be interesting to ask yourself this question. When I ask this in workshops or on coaching calls, I often hear answers like these: beeswax crayons, math gnomes, play silks, main lesson books, a nature table, circle time, artistic work. These are like the visible, tangible things, right, that are often associated with Waldorf education. But I think we often make the mistake of concluding that those outer tangibles are the method, when in fact, a method consists not only of the tangibles, but also the philosophy and the reasoning behind the method, the hows and the whys. Much of what we associate with Waldorf is representative of what we see in Waldorf schools today, or maybe even on Pinterest or Instagram. Now, I was one of those in the early days too, where I think I was most drawn to Waldorf by not specific tangibles, but just this sense of beauty, right? That it preserved childhood. It was a bit slower in introducing academics, and we surrounded children by beauty and the natural world. I loved those aspects of Waldorf from the very beginning. So first, in this episode, I want to just ground us in a few insights to keep in mind as we go further in our exploration, because I think this helps make it more real, right, in our minds. Like, how can this apply to our home schools? Makes it more real and practical. So 3 things just right off the bat. Insights that I want to share with you. One is that this method, the Waldorf method, was created by Rudolf Steiner over 100 years ago in Germany for the classroom. That's the first insight. The second is that Steiner never wrote down a curriculum. Many believe that he intended to, but never had a chance to before his death, about 5.5 years after the opening of the first Waldorf school. So he opened one school and that was it. He didn't create a whole movement that grew over time. All right. Insight number 3 is that the curriculum was really created then by piecing together Steiner's lectures, comments, and articles. He was a prolific speaker and writer. And then also by trial and error. Most of what we have available in terms of curriculum today that we can purchase comes from translating current classroom practice in Waldorf schools. And then those schools, the method has evolved over the years. So those schools base their practices on what's evolved from that very first school back in 1919. All right, just some insights. To me, these details of history are encouraging and freeing in a lot of ways, because as I see it, this all means that we have some leeway, right? We have some room to interpret this method for ourselves and our time. I actually like to start when I started studying Waldorf. I became fascinated by Steiner's lectures to those very first teachers in the first school. And I think this is a great starting point to add perspective to what we see going on in Waldorf schools today, because they're not always exactly the same, right? So the first teacher training, which Steiner called the Teacher's Seminar, took place in August of 1919, when Rudolf Steiner gave 3 lectures a day, 6 days a week for 2 weeks to a group of hand-selected professionals, most of whom were actually not trained teachers. And then the school opened its doors. So imagine that, preparing for 2 weeks and then giving it a go. If you want to hear more about that first school, I encourage you to check out episode 43 here on the podcast, which is called Top 10 Lessons from Steiner's 1919 Seminar Course. You can find it at artofhomeschooling.com/episode 43. Now, let's look back at the list we created. Remember the question, what is Waldorf? So the truth is that Waldorf education is not necessarily just these tangible things, as I mentioned. And I just want to point out some misunderstandings, perhaps, or fallacies about some of these tangible aspects that we associate with Waldorf education. So in fact, math gnomes and no black crayons, if you've ever heard of that, and circle time were not actually something Steiner ever even talked about. These developed over time with teachers in Waldorf schools. So just a tiny bit about each of these. Math gnomes were created by 2 Waldorf teachers in one of the very first American schools, many years after Steiner had passed away. If you've ever heard that there are no black crayons in Waldorf classrooms or in the Waldorf approach, that comes from Steiner responding to a teacher's question with the suggestion that some children always choose black crayons, right, when they're given the choice. So in order for the child to experience many different colors, then it might be best to remove the black crayons from the set for a while. That's what Rudolf Steiner said. And then that's where that developed into, okay, we're never going to let the children use black crayons. And then circle time. I find this fascinating because I love circle time. I really love poems and songs and movement games and things like that. But circle time can be hard in a homeschool setting, as many of us know. So that was actually a part of nursery schools. Circle time, the phrase circle time came from the nursery schools in the US and Great Britain in the middle of the century, around 1950 or so, not from the very first school. It was in the 50s or 60s. And Steiner never spoke about that. He did talk about ring games, he called them, and said that they have a community building effect. So therefore, we could translate that to circle time would too. And he also spoke about warm-up activities such as verse recitation, but he never actually said to begin each day with circle time. Interesting, huh? All right. I love gaining a little perspective here like this. As Stephen Segarin, a Waldorf teacher and trainer, says, quote, what Steiner had to say leaves open many more possibilities than are available in practice today, end quote. Whew. All right. So why choose the Waldorf approach for homeschooling? And what does that look like? I'll start by sharing my short description of Waldorf and then go into a little more detail on each of these aspects. So first, my short answer. What is Waldorf? Well, here is what drew me to the method and what continues to inspire me about this hands-on, holistic, experiential approach. I like to call this the one-sentence elevator pitch, and here it is. Waldorf education is a developmental approach to learning that incorporates rhythm and the lively arts into the lessons. When I talk about what I love most about Waldorf, it's all in there in that sentence. It's a developmental approach that incorporates rhythm and the lively arts. Love that. All right, so now let's look at each of these aspects individually. What is a developmental approach? Well, the Waldorf curriculum is designed to match the stages of child development. And then the stages of child development really become the starting point of the curriculum and all the lessons. Steiner felt that any enlightened approach to education is based on the teacher's ability to respond to each stage of a child's development appropriately. Perhaps you've heard the phrase thinking, feeling, willing to describe the Waldorf approach. These are three types of human activity, and really all three need to be addressed in our teaching, but differently and at different ages and stages. If we go in order of development, the phrase would actually be willing, feeling, thinking. Young children learn primarily, and this is before about the age of 7, they learn primarily through their will or their actions. Elementary age children through their feeling, and teens through their thinking, much more like us as adults. I think many would agree that mainstream schools of our time, and even in Steiner's day, consider thinking or the intellect to be the most important aspect of learning. As a result, lessons are arranged to fill students with knowledge, to impart knowledge to them. But one of Steiner's main goals in developing the Waldorf approach was to combat what he called, and this is a quote, the deadly forces of the abstract. He felt the abstract was totally dominating teaching and learning in his day. That approach of a teacher being up front in front of a group of students, giving a lecture from a textbook perhaps, and the students taking notes. So he set out to set up an approach that could combat this abstract way of learning, particularly for younger children, because he felt like developmentally this wasn't appropriate until after about the age of 12 or 14. He really wanted to create a teaching method that addresses all of these stages. And at the same time, he wanted the approach to be tailored to stages of development and then shift accordingly as children grow and are able to take in learning in new ways. Steiner believed, like other educators and psychologists, that development happens in these 7-year cycles. So his approach is different for each of these stages. And the stages are from age 0 to 7, from 7 to 14, from 14 to 21. And this developmental approach has appealed to me from when I first encountered Waldorf, because in my observations of children, these stages seem to be so spot on. The description of how children learn at these different stages just really seems to ring so true for me on a deep level. All right, the second aspect that I want to point out from my one sentence elevator pitch of Waldorf is rhythm. So Waldorf incorporates rhythm, which helps bring both comfort and order. Rhythm is a critical part of learning. And as far as I know, Rudolf Steiner was the first educator to acknowledge that. So when we design a daily rhythm of activities, a flow of activities one to another throughout the day, children know what to expect, and this improves their learning. You can go check out episode 3, which is all about this foundational piece of rhythm if you want to hear more about it. But it's really a matter of alternating active and calm activities, which allows the learning to settle in. Alternating active and calm activities in early childhood, that might look like playtime alternates with focused group time. In the kindergarten years, not only is that alternating the open play and focus time, but there can be a rhythm to the week where maybe there's painting on Mondays, baking on Tuesdays, modeling with clay or beeswax on Wednesdays, and making soup or doing some baking on Thursdays, and an outing on Fridays, just as an example. There are all kinds of rhythms that include, there's the rhythm of the day, the rhythm of the week, and the rhythm of the seasons, right? Where one follows another in a repeating pattern or sequence. And working with all of these rhythms is a great place to start when planning any Waldorf program. In the elementary and high school years, then, we teach using a 2-day lesson rhythm by presenting new material one day and then reviewing it the next. And this allows children to what's known as sleep on it, right? To take in the new knowledge, the new material through story, but as a part of the learning process, to let it rest before we move on to something else new. And in my own experience as a teacher in a variety of settings, public school, private school, homeschool, increasing rhythmic activity always helps the teaching and the learning go more smoothly. So I highly recommend you explore that concept of rhythm. All right. And number 3 is the lively arts. Waldorf incorporates the lively arts into all the lessons. So you could just think of this as the arts. They form a foundation for all play and work in the Waldorf method. Lively arts such as storytelling, music, movement, drama, poetry, painting, drawing, and modeling. The arts really, they inspire focus, right? They engage interest and they help to improve memory. The arts really, what they do is awaken our heart forces Students develop both capacities and skills using this approach. And Steiner was convinced that the way to combat the abstract, remember that motivation for him, the way to combat the abstract is through artistic work, which involves the whole human being, right? Head, heart, and hands, body, mind, and spirit. He said that as teachers, we want to, and here is a quote, secure the strengthening of the will through artistic means, end quote. And I've seen this over and over again. The arts really do help children engage with the learning and become more active learners. Really, at every age, Waldorf education balances artistic, academic, and practical work in a way that addresses how children learn at each stage of development. Okay, so those are the three key elements of Waldorf to me, that it's a developmental approach that incorporates rhythm and the lively arts into the lessons. These three aspects continue to draw me to Waldorf to this day. And then I would add a fourth component to why I'm so drawn to this approach, and that is honoring the inner life and personal development of the teacher. So this is often referred to as inner work. It's really about strengthening our inner forces to be present with our children. And in Waldorf circles, it's a critical part of the educational journey. I always say homeschooling is a journey, right? And you, dear parent, are on a journey of discovery yourself, right alongside your children. And I love that Waldorf acknowledges this and encourages us to really explore our own inner world and build some strength in that way. Okay, so now I just want to give you a little bit more background into my own personal experience. Before I had children, I studied education in graduate school. I have a Master of Arts in Teaching. And that's when I learned about hands-on teaching and learning. Waldorf was actually never mentioned in my grad school program, but that was the time that I began to hear about experiential education and studies that show that students who are taught with a hands-on method actually outperform those who aren't, and also have better retention of what they're learning. If you're wondering what experiential education even means, here is a description from the Association for Experiential Education. They say, quote, experiential education is a philosophy in which educators purposefully engage with learners in direct experience and focused reflection in order to increase knowledge, develop skills, clarify values, and develop people's capacities to contribute to their communities, end quote. Love that. So I would say that starting in grad school, for me, I knew that my teaching would be experiential in nature. From the very beginning, I knew that. Okay, so next phase, when my children came along and we decided to homeschool, I set out to dig a little deeper into experiential hands-on approaches. And I discovered that there were three methods, or these are the ones that are probably the most well-known and are very experiential in nature themselves. They include the Charlotte Mason method, Montessori, and Waldorf, all three of those. So I set out to compare these three approaches for our family in the early homeschooling years. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that most of us are probably eclectic homeschoolers, right? Where we combine a variety of approaches. We look at our children and see what they need. We factor in what appeals to us most, and we bring a combination, right? But I also think that leaning toward one approach and getting clear on why can be super helpful to give you both clarity and confidence in your homeschooling. And as I said before, can help it have a stronger foundation so that it's more sustainable in the long run. Okay, so I would say that each of these three approaches I've mentioned have some things in common, even beyond their focus on hands-on experiential learning. The three founders, Charlotte Mason, Maria Montessori, and Rudolf Steiner, were British, Italian, and German, respectively, and each had a deep desire to contribute to bringing about a better world through education. Deep commitment to that. The founders also shared a desire to counteract what's described as industrialized schooling, which I mentioned earlier. That was the standard practice 100 plus years ago of training a child from a very young age for one specific job. None of these educators advocated the use of textbooks or testing for young children, even into the elementary years. They really believed in experiential hands-on learning. They each created a method built on a liberal arts foundation that honors the child as both a physical and spiritual being. And this gives me a deep respect for all of these approaches. All three methods advocate for a home-like environment in the kindergarten years, in the early years, with lots of time spent outdoors. And all three incorporate stories and books into the lessons in some way. But what I love about Waldorf is that the human connection and interaction is where the learning happens. And as mentioned above, that we can go deeper with these ideas of rhythm and the lively arts, plus focus on our own self-development as the leader of our homeschools. How does all of this translate then to homeschooling itself? Here are a few more things about Waldorf that I think work really well in a homeschool setting. So, my 30 plus years of teaching experience post-graduate school has really shown me that Waldorf main lesson block learning, incorporating the arts, really makes for memorable lessons, more than any other approach that I know of. I've observed over and over again that children are engaged and retain the learning in a deeper way with this block approach. So what does that look like? Generally, all new material is brought through story with the Waldorf approach. We can find beautifully written stories, right? Deeply moving stories to help us do the teaching. So we share a story one day and engage in some lively arts. Then we let it rest. The next day, we review the story and summarize it to help seal in the learning. And we do this with one lesson topic or main lesson topic at a time for about 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes 6 weeks, it can range. But teaching in blocks and making main lesson books to record the learning, it really makes for more efficient teaching. Rather than using textbooks or worksheets, children create main lesson books of their own making to help them record and remember what they've learned. So this is really a great place to start for Waldorf-inspired learning. Setting up your year in main lesson blocks, which is really a type of rhythm, right? And infusing the lessons with the arts. Not only is this developmentally appropriate for children, it addresses that whole human being, as I said, head, heart, and hands, and also helps to strengthen the will so that children grow up to take their place in the world and make their contributions to their community. If you want to hear more about what this looks like in specific terms and even see a sample block organized around just one book, I encourage you to go check out episode number 16, where my friend Allison and I talk about how stories make great teachers. You can find it at artofhomeschooling.com/episode 16. So here's what I've discovered to be so very true about Waldorf-inspired homeschooling. This approach really does inspire lifelong learning in children and enable them to fully develop their unique capacities. The Waldorf approach is a holistic liberal arts education where subjects are not separated from one another, but are integrated in these main lesson blocks, and education honors the child's body, mind, and spirit. Additionally, in a homeschool setting, we have the benefit of focusing on lessons for part of the day, and then also having some time in the day for children to explore their own interests as well. So I'd like to end with a great quote from Alan Whitehead in his little book, A Waldorf Homeschool, ? And in that book, Whitehead says that Waldorf homeschooling is the best of the best. That is his opinion. And he says that because children get the independence of homeschooling, right? The homeschool setting can help children really develop their independence in a beautiful way. And then that is coupled with the hands-on experiential Waldorf approach that's so rich in learning experiences and stories and connections, the best of the best. I hope this episode has helped you consider more deeply your own homeschooling approach and why you do what you do. If you want to bring more of the Waldorf approach to your homeschool, then I invite you to join me and a wonderful group of homeschooling parents just like you inside Inspired at Home. This monthly membership offers classes, coaching, and community, so you can create a homeschooling life you love that's simple, inspiring, and doable. We have over 25 masterclasses at this point, maybe 30 probably at this point. Just a few of them include why Waldorf works, accepting our children, which has a focus on some of the developmental milestones, and then also reset your rhythm. There's so many masterclasses inside. You can find all the details at artofhomeschooling.com/inspired-at-home. Thank you so much for listening in today. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that this episode has really inspired you to take a deeper look at what you're doing with your lessons and your hands-on experiences that you bring to your children. You can find the show notes for this episode at artofhomeschooling.com/episode 60. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. That's all for today, my friend. But here's what I want you to remember. Rather than perfection, let's focus on connection. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Art of Homeschooling podcast.